everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to all of you joining from all parts of the world today, from Africa to Asia, Middle East to Europe, and Oceania to South and North America. I am Umaima Mandro, founder and president of One League, a global education institution with the mission to connect the world's most gifted, underserved talent with world-class education and opportunities to make a meaningful dent in the universe, offered in collaboration with Harvard, Stanford, and MIT. Welcome One League Fellows, esteemed faculty, One League Global mentors, and friends to today's very special event with our special guest, Tim Brown, hosted by One League faculty member, Professor Scott Johns. Scott, a huge heartfelt thanks to you for introducing us to Tim, for making today's event possible, or for being such an integral part of One League. And thank you, Tim, from the bottom of our hearts for being here with us today. Before we get started, a brief word about today's event. Scott will introduce us all to Tim Brown and lead the discussion with Tim for the first 45 minutes or so. Throughout this time, we welcome you all to use the Zoom chat feature to add your comments, reflections, and most importantly, your questions for Tim. The last 15 minutes are reserved for questions from the audience. When Scott calls your name, you will get the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask your question directly of Tim. Also, please upvote the questions as they come in so we can get to as many top voted questions as possible. So with that, welcome, Scott. Very warm welcome to you, Tim. And Scott, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Umaima. This is such an incredible and choice event. I am so excited to introduce Tim to the wonderful students that we have at One League and beyond. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Tim to you, and it should come as no surprise that he is incredibly celebrated and has accomplished much in his life. So let me go ahead and introduce Tim. Tim Brown is the co-chair of IDEO and was formerly the CEO of IDEO for 19 years. Tim helped transform IDEO from a leading industrial design firm known for projects like Apple's first computer mouse into a systems thinking organization in sectors ranging from healthcare to education to management. Under Tim's lead, IDEO became skilled at not just building products, but building systems-wide interdisciplinary services. Additionally, Tim helped IDEO launch new organizational arms focused on humanitarian efforts, venture projects, and education. An industrial designer by training, Tim frequently speaks about the value of design thinking, creative leadership, and innovation to business leaders and designers around the world. Tim has earned numerous design awards and has exhibited work at the Design Museum in London and the Museum of Modern Art in New York, amongst other places. Tim has been awarded a CBE for services to design in Queen Elizabeth's Honours List, which stands for Commander of the Order of the British Empire. Tim advises senior executives and boards of global Fortune 100 companies. He serves on the board of directors of Steelcase Inc. and is a member of the Board of Trustees of IDEO.org. He writes for the Harvard Business Review, The Economist, and many other prominent publications. He participates in the World Economic Forum, and his talks Serious Play and Change by Design appear on TED.com. Tim is also the author of the seminal book on design thinking, Change by Design, published by HarperCollins, and is largely responsible for popularizing the term design thinking. He contributes as one of LinkedIn's original top 150 influencers, and he is also an instructor for the IDEO Leading for Creativity course. Tim takes special interest in the ways in which design can be used to promote the well-being of people all over the world. And I just have to say, as a former employee of IDEO and someone who has looked up to Tim for decades now, Tim is a leader who walks the walk. He is someone who makes the world a better place everywhere he goes. He seeks to collaborate and listen and engages with everyone in a kind and considerate way. And beyond this, I know Tim to be a devoted and loving husband and father. And so with that, Tim, we welcome you here to One League.
Well, Scott, thank you very much. That was a very kind and generous, slightly embarrassing introduction, but thank you. It's yeah, lovely and tremendous to be with everybody today, to be connected to so many people all over the world. So yeah, delighted to be with you.
Wonderful. Well, let's go ahead and dive right in, Tim. And at One League, we really like to start from the beginning. So could you tell us a bit about your upbringing? What were some of the values that were most important in your household growing up?
Well, you can possibly tell from the accent that I didn't grow up in California, but grew up in rural England, and very ordinary background, really. Nothing particularly different about it. I was fortunate enough to have parents who were very open and interested in whatever I was interested in, and let me spend all my time, as I did back then, avoiding most sporting activities, and instead disappearing up into my room and building things and drawing things and painting things and making things. Learned early on that I preferred that to getting beaten up on the football field, or even worse, the rugby field. Yeah, I don't know. It's funny because I've really thought about what the kind of values were in our family. I mean, like all families, we had our ups and downs. I do think, though, that my mother, who did not have much of an education, and had gone into sort of relatively ordinary service jobs out of school, and then met my father and had a family. When I was very young, decided that she had a kind of a mission in her life, and that she wanted to be a teacher. So she went back to college when soon after my youngest brother was born, and ultimately became a school teacher, and then a school principal. She running schools in the Middle East and in the UK, and just had a very successful career, and that totally shifted my point of view on what was possible in terms of deciding you wanted to achieve something. And actually, rather more so than my father, to be really honest with you. And so I sort of looked up to her. She worked incredibly hard to be successful, but made me realize that if you wanted something, and it doesn't matter where you started from, you had if you were passionate enough about it and you brought enough of yourself to it, that all things were possible. So I think that probably impacted me more than anything else.
Wonderful. Sounds like a very important and vital lesson for you. Take us forward into your career journey. What led you to design, and what did that look like for you, Tim?
Well, it's funny. I'll stay back there, and growing up in England, I was a very mediocre high school student. Really, literally mediocre. I used to get B's in everything except art, and so that was one indicator early on. Like, okay, this is the only thing I can get an A in. But also, I reflect on it later. I had no idea at the time. It's like my problem was I was interested in everything, but not really deeply interested in anything. And so I would sort of spread my efforts all over the place. But I realized later on, that was really useful in the beginnings to be a designer, because that's what design's all about. It's about connecting things. And it would have been great if I'd have been brilliant at everything, but unfortunately, my brain is not up to that. But anyhow, as a mediocre student, I just wasn't likely to go and be like all my friends who were going off to be engineers and going off to do fancy things at big universities. And so I decided very early on that I wanted to go to art school, but I didn't discover design. I mean, I knew about design, and I sort of playfully thought I was fairly obsessed with cars, like many boys as a young boys, and so I sort of interested in designing them. Rapidly learned that designing cars meant spending the first 10 years of a career designing hubcaps and steering wheels, which was not at all exciting for me. So went off and discovered design school, and really discovered myself the moment I got to design school, and realized that life could be full of these wonderful projects, solving problems and making things that help solve problems for people. Making better things, whatever it was, whether it was furniture, whether it was electronic things, whether it was simple tools for everyday life, whether it was medical things, whatever. Just the joy of taking on a problem in order to make something that would make people's lives better. So yeah, went off to undergrad industrial design. Was, had many fortunate things, including, early on one of my professors asking me to write about design for a national magazine. So I got started writing about design as a sophomore student at undergrad, and sort of kept doing that from then on. And that's been an important part of, as you sort of mentioned, is an important part of my career. As much as doing design is also reflecting on design. And so I kind of got into that habit pretty early on. Went on from undergrad in Newcastle, North of England, to the Royal College of Art in London, where I got to meet really the best designers of my generation, and really pushed hard to think about what design meant to me. And from there was probably, I always think of I won the lottery the day I was literally graduating from the Royal College, and one of the founders of what became IDEO, Bill Mogridge, turned up and had a chat with me and ended up hiring me. And I, in my arrogant young self, thought I'd go and work for him for a couple of years and then set up my own studio. And here we are, 36 years later, I'm still with the same organization, because he was such an inspirational person and was working with so many other inspirational people. It was like, why would I ever want to go anywhere else? So.
Wonderful and fascinating. And I'm wondering, Tim, were there any design projects from those early days in your career that really stick out to you?
Well, I mean, I was trained as an industrial designer, so I was trained to design things, and enjoyed that. But as soon as Bill at the time, Bill Mogridge, was flirting with the idea of design moving from hardware to software. He'd coined the term interaction design just a little bit before I joined, like a year or so before I joined the company, and started to build a team of people who could bring design skills and design principles to software. That had never happened before. And so I turned up, spent a year in London, then moved out to California. And some of the first projects I was working on, I was being asked to design software. I didn't even know what software was, but I was being asked to design it, as well as the physical things that we were designing, being asked to take all of whatever I knew about design and apply it to an experience that was obviously totally different. And so yeah, I remember we were doing a piece of strategy work for a company that back then was quite a big computer company called Unisys. They're kind of still around, but they're not in the kind of consumer world anymore, or the sort of office world anymore. But anyway, back then they were a pretty big company, and we were doing some strategy work for them, and I was kind of flailing around trying to figure out how to be a designer, how to bring deep design research and interaction design and industrial design together. And it was really difficult, but was the moment when I perhaps finally understood what it was like to try and design at a systems level. And that affected me and continued to impact the way I've thought about design ever since. And that would have been back in the late 1980s, I guess.
Early software, amazing. Let's fast forward. So IDEO, you came and joined IDEO. Of course, IDEO has become world renowned and has really driven the world of design and design thinking, pushed it forward. And it's grown tremendously during your time. I'm wondering, Tim, as you reflect back, what are some of the factors that attributed to the success of the rise of IDEO?
I mean, if I'm really honest, I think I'd say a lot of it was good timing, to be honest. I mean, we were growing as a company at a moment when America was having a bit of a renaissance around design, and business started to get interested in design, and particularly the business press started to get interested in design in the sort of mid 90s and late 90s, and late 90s, I guess it was. Magazines like Business Week started getting interested in the role of design. And I would say one thing that made IDEO a little different from other companies was that right from the beginning, we sort of grappled with what it is we were trying to do, because we were trying to do design at a slightly more complex level than most other people. We were more interdisciplinary than most other design firms at the time. I mean, you know, you'd find a design firm that was mostly the same people. They were industrial designers or maybe graphic designers, maybe with a few other things sprinkled in. But when David and Bill and Mike actually formed IDEO in 1991, what was special about it is we had, you know, dozens of really fantastically ingenious engineers, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. We had design researchers, we had interaction designers, we had product designers. So it was already a very kind of, from a skills perspective, a very diverse organization. So we were taking on more complex problems. And so we were constantly trying to figure out how to explain that to clients. We were quite public about it. And I think that sort of kind of working in public attitude got picked up by some of these early media folks that were interested in design. So they came and asked us what it was we were doing. And then they wrote about us. And so then we got we got some exposure, and that thing started to, you know, and we had things like rather classic Nightline did a video, did a kind of a news story about IDEO back in '99. That ended up being used as a kind of teaching case in almost every business school I know, and a lot of design schools too. We had a front cover of Business Week. A whole bunch of things happened that just happened, I think, because we were willing and trying to explain what it was we did at a time when people were interested. So maybe there were probably other things too, but that felt like it was a pretty important, an important moment. We were fortunate with the timing, and we were fortunate in a way that we were happy to be public about how we worked.
Yeah, amazing, interesting, and serendipitous. It sounds like that.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Now IDEO, there is something called the Little Book of IDEO, which I know you were very involved in. Can you share with us, what is this and why is it important for IDEO and its culture?
It's a funny thing. It's a kind of a lot. We could have had this conversation at different times over the last 10 years, and I'd probably give you a different answer about why it was important or why maybe it wasn't as important as I thought it was. But about 10 years ago now, or maybe a little bit longer ago than that, we were getting to a point where some of our founders were retiring. A lot of our original team, folks who had been there at the beginning were beginning to move on to other things, and we were a little worried that what had made us great, or at least made us what we were, was going to fade away as the people faded away, and we felt like IDEO wasn't so much special because of what it did, as much as how it did it, and so we thought we've been living a whole set of, we call them values, but we don't know how to talk to them. We don't know how to tell other people about them, particularly other people that were coming into the firm. So the cool thing was we didn't have to go and make up a bunch of values. Like, this is how we would like to be. We simply looked at ourselves, said, how do we do things? What is it we seem to do that stands out, right? What is it we seem to do that seems to come up time and time again, that seems important? And so it was pretty quick, actually, that these 7 things bubble to the top. And that they were observations. They weren't aspirations. And I think that's probably why they've survived relatively well, even though they've had to evolve and will continue to evolve. But they really were things we could see in ourselves that seemed to be important, the way we got to the results that we got to. And so we wrote them all down, put them in this little book, which, because we bound it in red, ended up becoming often called the Little Red Book of IDEO, inside IDEO. But it's sort of like the software code for IDEO in some way. So it's like if you understand these things, then you've got a pretty good chance of figuring out what's going on when you're in this, what otherwise is a pretty chaotic place. The thing that was interesting is we called them values at the time, and since then I've done a lot of similar work with other, excuse me, there's gardeners in the background, I apologize if that's coming through my headphones. I've done a lot of similar work with other organizations, and a couple of years ago I was working with the leadership team at the pharma company Moderna, who were on an incredible ride of their own at the time in the middle of the COVID pandemic, trying to figure out what their values were. they were dealing with exactly the same problem, and we came to this point of view that actually these are not values, they're mindsets. They're not what we stand for, they're how we think and how we behave. And so I've come to realize that actually that it's much more useful to think of them as mindsets, not values. I mean, we have lots of values, some of which are absolutely inherent to those mindsets, but there are other things we care about that are not stated there, like the way we have impact in the world and that kind of stuff. And so I think it's actually helpful to distinguish between values and mindsets. And I think organizations often confuse the two on reflection, like we certainly did. And actually, for somebody new coming into an organization, it's relatively easy to understand what the values might be. It's relatively hard to understand how people think, if they think differently. And yet it's incredibly important to understand how people think, because it affects how they make decisions. It affects what happens in the dynamics when people are working as a group and how they collaborate. It affects what people think is more important or less important. And so anyway, that's a relatively recent perspective on my part, but I think if I was to do them again, they would be called mindsets, not values.
Very interesting. And I'm wondering, Tim, of those mindsets, be optimistic, collaborate, take ownership, embrace ambiguity, talk less, do more, learn from failure, make others successful. Is there one that resonates more with you now than the others, or how do you look across each of those?
It depends on what lens I'm looking at. Things I'd say from a what is special about these with regard to design and or creativity. I think I would have to probably say, and I'm not sure it's articulated in quite the right way, but talk less, do more is it. What lays beneath that is that what's important about design is converting ideas into reality, actually making ideas real in order to learn about them, in order for them to make progress. And that's what's very special about creativity, is you take something that's a very abstract concept or a thought and make it real and express it in some way. However that might be, it might be music, it might be theater, or it might be a product, or it might be a piece of software. But that's what's so important about creativity, and the methods and skills and aptitudes and determination we have for making thoughts into real expressions is at the very heart of creativity. So that one means a lot because I think it's often underappreciated. We tend to, particularly when we talk about design thinking, we think we're done when we've got a bunch of post-its with ideas on them. And that's not even the beginning of the process, right? I mean, that's, of course it is the beginning. It's part way along, but it's so small a part of the journey. So much of the journey is about converting whatever those little snippets of ideas are into something that's expressed in a meaningful, real way, and can play somewhere. And that's really difficult. Right? That's the hard part. And I think that's so underappreciated. And so people who've got a bias towards a bias towards taking an idea and doing something with it, rather than just kind of, basking in the idea, which is very tempting to do. It's very tempting to say, I had a great idea, and then use some words to describe the idea, which you sort of had an idea, but it's not really very important because you didn't do anything with it, right? And so I tend to think that one's pretty important. And they've all got interesting qualities to them, and they're all interesting to think about in different ways. I've always been a big fan of making others successful, because it's actually not something you see in creativity all the time. You often see individual competition between people and people wanting to put a stamp on their own ideas. And yet, I believe, just like, if you watch the great teams in the world of football, and I mean world football, not American football, they play as teams, not as individual stars. And I think that's true of creativity too. If you are dealing with a creative problem that's large scale enough that you need multiple people involved, and not all creative problems need that, but if you are, then you have to have people who are interested in making each other successful, in my view.
Very interesting. I want to pull on this mindset thread a bit more. You've written and talked a lot about this mindset, design thinking as a mindset. I'm wondering if you can talk about what that means for you, and how does someone go about developing that mindset or practicing that mindset?
The thing I love about mindsets is I think of them as a bit like costumes. You can take them on and take them off if you want. I mean, if you've got the discipline to do so, they're learnable things. They're a state, and literally, I mean, it's a state of mind, right? And you can with some practice and some discipline, you can put yourself into different states of mind. We do that all the time. And I think that actually makes some elements of creativity a little bit more accessible to people. And so that's why I like the concept. I mean, some of them require the addition of some skill, and obviously those skill or practices can take some acquisition. They don't necessarily naturally come to people. I was just talking about the importance of going from ideas to a tangible expression of an idea. Well, if that requires you to draw something, or requires you to use a piece of software to make something happen, or to play a piece of music, none of those things necessarily come naturally to us if we haven't acquired those practices or those skills. So that that is inevitably connected to this idea of mindsets. We need to understand what skills we need in order to practice those mindsets. But and in some cases they can be very difficult to acquire. Maybe we'll talk a little bit later about how some of them are getting easier to acquire because of technology. But I do think the nice thing about mindsets is that you can acquire them. You can put yourself into states of mind. As a group, you can decide, we're going to work on making each other successful. And you can kind of agree on it, right? We are going to go into this problem not trying to I'm not trying to win compared to my team members. We're all trying to win by creating something that's right for the problem that we're solving. And we're going to agree that, and we're going to behave in a way that achieves that to the best we can. That's something you can decide.
Yeah, and in your book, Change by Design: How Design Thinking Transforms Organizations and Inspires Innovation, you talk about this within organizations. But I'm wondering, what do you believe are the barriers to innovation and creativity within organizations? And how can organizations create environments where innovation, design thinking mindset, and creativity can thrive?
Well, I mean, there are obviously lots of barriers. Most of it is inertia and status quo. I mean, it's like we're doing the thing that we're doing, and we're trying to do it to whatever the best of our ability is, and we keep doing it. And we forget to stop and ask questions about either why we're doing it or why we might be doing it differently, until something comes and disrupts the whatever we're doing. I mean, it's why so often you don't see organizations significantly taking innovation or creativity significantly seriously until something comes and whacks them in the side, and threatens to disrupt them, or disrupt everybody. I mean, that's partly one of the sort of things that I think has changed so much since the beginning of my career, is that, at least this is my own perception. It could just be getting older. So I will admit that it might just be me getting older. But my feeling is that when I was first started working in the late 80s, where we were, I mean, looking back on it now, we were getting to the end of what I would call the industrial era. At least in Europe and North America. It felt like we knew how everything worked, right? I mean, yes, there were new technologies that were important that were coming out all the time. Perhaps we didn't realize quite how important they were going to be, but we knew how everything worked. And so a lot of design was about making existing things better. Whereas today we have these massively disruptive situations in front of everybody, not just individual industries, not just individual companies, but everybody. And we realize that we have to we can't, it's not about making things better, it's making things totally differently, or maybe not making things at all in many cases. That's a very different view of the world, which in my view increases the argument for creativity and innovation, not decreasing it. But of course, in a world that's kind of chaotic and constantly changing, it can be quite hard for organizations, businesses in particular, kind of focus on that, to actually commit to innovation when everything seems to be changing around them all the time, and they're kind of fighting to survive a little bit, which is, I think, what's feels more like the situation we've been in more recently. But lack of curiosity, lack of stopping to ask questions, lack of thinking about the future, to be honest with you. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed, again, in the last 20 years or so, has been that businesses have got even less interested in looking at the future than they once were. Back in the 80s and 90s, you did have businesses, particularly tech businesses, who were willing to think about where their technology might be going and actually speculate about the future. And you had companies like Apple and Xerox and AT&T, and there's a long list of them, that used to spend serious time on using design to imagine what the future might be, and use that to guide, in some cases very successfully use it to guide them. I mean, Apple created, if you go out on YouTube and look for Apple Knowledge Navigator, you'll find a set of videos that were made in the late 80s, early 90s, that described what Apple thought the future of computing was. And right at this moment, it's kind of interesting because they're literally showing AI assistants and chatbots working on slates and other mobile devices. And that video is credited with convincing Apple that there was going to be this integration of communications, computing, and content. And ultimately that led to things like Newton, and then iPhone and everything else. Now, it's not necessarily a direct straight line, but it set Apple up to realize that content was going to matter. And you arguably, the thing that really made Apple great was realizing that devices plus content win. And so that's just one example of a company back then thinking about the future in a way that really helped them navigate, pardon the pun. So I've noticed that fewer and fewer organizations do that today. And at a moment when we're trying to figure out what kind of future we want as societies, whether that's to do with dealing with climate or economic opportunity or equity and inclusion, all of these things that will not fix themselves unless we decide what we want. We are not using the tools of design in the way that I think we could to explore and imagine what those futures could be like.
Very helpful, very insightful. I'm going to go slightly off script and just say for many of the students here, they are going to be leading the way for design and design thinking. And I'm wondering if you have any suggestions or tips for them as they think about that in their countries and in the organizations they are working in or founding.
I mean, it's very hard, isn't it? I mean, I hesitate to offer advice other than don't be satisfied unless you're working on something that you're really committed to and believe in. That's easy to say, hard to do. I think one of the most exciting changes that I've seen in the last decade or so has been really the kind of change in the balance of power of creativity, if you like, where it used to be that the West, particularly Europe and America, because it educated so many more designers than anybody else, because it had a huge creative services industry, it kind of generated more ideas than anywhere else. But that has changed now. I mean, in so many cases, in so many fields, and particularly in things like entertainment, the best and most interesting ideas are not coming from what you used to think about the centers of creativity. And I think that is true now more and more of entrepreneurialism. It's true more and more of interesting new technologies, particularly. I mean, I've been helping out Prince William's Earthshot Prize, which is a big climate prize that got launched a couple of years ago. And I was with all of the winners back in January back in England. And these were organizations from all over the world, literally all over the world, from Aboriginal communities in Australia to entrepreneurs from the Middle East, from everywhere. And really exciting new ideas about materials, about changing the way we do things. And it really is clear that we now have a kind of a global wealth of creativity, and so the opportunities are, to have new ideas and to make an impact exist everywhere today. And some of the means for connecting those together and and for all of us to learn from them also exist more than they ever have done before. So I think that's tremendously exciting.
Wonderful, thank you. And Tim, recently IDEO unveiled what they're calling This Work Can't Wait, which is an effort to design a more equitable and sustainable future. I'm wondering, can you talk to us about what led to this work and what excites you about this work?
Well, I think it's really, it wasn't new for us. I mean, in the sense that, we've been interested in working on challenges that we believe matter or that have a high degree of purpose, if you want to call it that, for quite some time. I mean, I for instance, started getting interested in how design could play a bigger role in helping or benefiting people who who have very little resource a long time ago, and started thinking about the idea of design for social impact. 15 more than, well, actually, that first article that I wrote, and I mentioned earlier when I was an undergrad, I was talking about that and what design ought to be doing. So that was 40 years ago, but a little bit more recently than that, I got interested in the idea of design for social impact, and traveled to India, and along with a good friend of mine, Jacqueline Novogratz, who's the founder of the Acumen Fund. She was one of the first social impact investors, and went to visited a bunch of her projects with Jacqueline, and actually with Chris Anderson, who runs TED. And everywhere I looked, I saw really interesting opportunities for design, and happened to meet somebody on that trip who I was very impressed with. She was about to go and become an Acumen Fellow. As soon as she was done with the fellowship, I persuaded her to come to IDEO. Her name is Jocelyn Wyatt, and we started working on what design for social impact at IDEO might look like. Found it very difficult to get the funding we needed to do the work, so we ended up setting up as its own nonprofit. Founded IDEO.org about 12 years ago now, and that's grown to its own team of 80 designers, with an office in Nairobi and then in the States, and working on projects in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and Southeast Asia, and domestically in the US. And I think it's been quite successful. So we've been thinking about design at this kind of higher order of purpose for quite some time, and not just there as well, but in healthcare and other places. But still that's not what the majority of organizations come and ask for. And so we wanted to start kind of framing it up a little bit, and also recognizing that some issues that we had not taken seriously enough, like equity and inclusion, and even climate. I mean, we've been interested in climate for a long time, but never really quite figured out how to kind of coalesce around some points of view and perspectives about it. So we decided it was time to talk about the work that we thought was pointing the way to the future. And that's really what This Work Can't Wait was all about. And to be truthful, it can't wait, right? This is not work that we can put off forever, and it's too easy to put it off and deal with the day-to-day. It's too easy to say, it's too difficult. It's too difficult to solve the climate problem. It's too difficult to make society more equitable. Well, it's definitely too difficult if you actually don't tackle the problem, and it's definitely too difficult if you don't look to use whatever kind of ingenuity and creativity you have to try and figure out new ways of doing things, including, by the way, new ways of designing. So yeah, that's what it's been about, and it's been great. We've seen good response to it. We've got a rapidly growing climate practice at IDEO now, with some quite interesting work, doing some very exciting work around biodiversity and regeneration of biodiversity with Conservation International, which we're very excited about, but a lot of other cool things too. So yeah, it's fun.
Wonderful. And I think two-part question here. I'm wondering, as you reflect back, what is from your many projects and involvement in design, what is a project that is particularly salient to you? And then second part, what are challenges that you're interested in tackling today?
Well, I mean, I think I sort of touched on some of them there as I was just talking there, and I maybe jumped ahead a little bit. But funnily enough, that trip that I did with Jacqueline back in, it must have been about 2007, I think it was, maybe 5. Anyway, it was a long time ago. One of the things that came out of that was working with Acumen on one of their early businesses they're working with, which was around anti-malarial bed nets. And then that led on to some work around clean water. And we got a decent amount of funding from the Gates Foundation to look at, new approaches to providing clean water in various parts of the world. But it was really hard. We had this big idea of building this really big program, all these coalitions of companies willing to get involved. We couldn't get anybody interested, could not get anybody interested. And it was that frustration that led ultimately to saying, like, oh, okay, we're going to have to get funded by the kind of foundations who've got the kind of imagination to do that. We can't. We weren't getting traction from as a for-profit business. So that work with Acumen on clean water led to, I think, the decision to go form IDEO.org, and that's had a big impact on I think what we've achieved in the world. And so that's one example. There are many other examples of projects that were sort of kind of turning points. Many years ago, working for this young CEO who was just taking over as CEO of Steelcase, a guy called Jim Hackett, who we've gone on to work for. I mean, not only did he get excited about the work we did, he actually acquired IDEO. He was so excited about those. So for a while, we were owned by Steelcase, not anymore. But he had this insight, which was like, where he basically said to us, "I'm not so much interested in the innovative things you do for us. I'm really interested in how you teach us to be more innovative and more creative." And that was an insight that led to, a lot of what IDEO does today in helping organizations transform themselves, become more creative, build new kinds of organizations that are creatively oriented. We have our whole teaching arm called IDEO, and we've got all these things. I don't think we'd have done that without being helped to have that insight that actually we're doers, but we're also teachers a little bit. So that was another pretty important one.
Yeah, awesome. And then second part, what challenges are you excited about today to tackle?
Well, personally, I'm spending as much of my time as I can on climate-related things. I mean, it's when you train as an industrial designer like I did, and this was a realization I had some years ago. I gave a talk. Actually, funnily enough, I gave a talk at the conference in San Francisco, the IDSA conference, which was the conference for which Airbnb founded themselves in order to find places for their friends to sleep for that conference. So anyway, it's just an interesting coincidence. But anyway, at that talk, I remember putting up a slide which was of a very large trash heap, where I sort of talked about the realization that I was pretty sure pretty much everything I'd ever designed over my previous 20 years as an industrial designer was now in a trash heap somewhere. Wasn't great feeling, right? I mean, and it doesn't matter how much good those products have done for people. It's like, yeah, but now they're filling up a trash heap. That surely isn't right. And so that was a while ago. I got involved in circular design. Been working closely with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation for some years. Created something called the Circular Design Guide, which is a sort of a set of it is what they are, design guidelines for designers that are interested in the circular economy. And I'm now working across a number of different sort of climate-related areas. And I love the systemic nature of climate as a problem, but I genuinely believe we're moving into a new era, that we've gone through the industrial era. We then went to the information or digital era, where so much growth and so much of our behavior is driven by digital technology. But for the first time going forward, if we're going to thrive, then we have to accept that we're in a climate era where what we do is constrained by the carrying capacity of the planet, and that's going to require an enormous shift in investment and an enormous opportunity for innovation, which, if we get it right, will allow future generations to thrive. If we get it wrong or continue to get it wrong, they may not even be here. And that's pretty high stakes. but it's also tremendously exciting, and creates so many opportunities. And so, I'm a bit of a, I mean, as I think most designers are, a little bit of a, addicted to optimism. And so I choose to be optimistic about that opportunity. And I want to get involved in some of those kinds of possibilities.
Wonderful. We have many great questions from the students here. Maybe let me just finish with one more of a personal question, and then we'll get into questions from our students. Tim, what brings you joy and fulfillment today?
Well, I think maybe a lot of people, when they've had a really rich and enjoyable, career and learned a lot of things, I enjoy passing that on where I can. I enjoy helping others figure out how to be more creative and how to apply themselves and to creative problems. So I love working with teams and organizations that are going on that journey. I find that I don't get the same. I mean, I enjoy being involved in a project and being there and grinding it out and figuring out what the new ideas are, but I'm not sure I'm actually all that. I'm not, I'm no better than many people who've got a lot less experience than me. In fact, not as good as many of them. And so I think I can be sometimes more useful in bringing my perspective. So I enjoy that. I enjoy helping teams, and I work with startups, and I work with teams doing different things. So that gives me that gives me a lot of fulfillment.
Wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and call on a few from the audience to ask your questions. If you could come up and introduce yourself and where you're from, and then ask your question. Let's start with Alejandro.
Hello, I am Alejandro Ortiz from Colombia, and I can believe I am going to ask a question to Tim Brown. Hello, Tim. By the way, my partner really admires you. She sends you a word of admiration and thankfulness for everything you have did and do to the world. My question is, what is the most important life lesson you have learned that you wish you had learned early on? Thank you.
I mean, life is a accumulation of a lot of lessons, right? I guess I don't know. It's very hard to say because, on my reflection is that some of these lessons we learn later on, that if you'd applied them at the beginning of your career, could have really screwed you up, and then you sort of have to kind of go through a series of learnings before you. But I wish I had been more confident about what I did earlier on. Now, it's not that I lack confidence, but I think there's, at least my field, the field of design, and particularly industrial design, was one which was largely ignored, and it sort of, you were sort of felt like you were fighting for the scraps a lot of the time, and that humility is not it has value, but that comes from that has value. But I wish I had a little bit more ambition for the kinds of things that we could take on earlier, so I could have got further. But I'm not entirely sure that even if I had, that it would have made any difference. But I actually don't regret too much. I guess the other the other lesson that I wish I'd learned earlier was I wish I'd been more exposed to the power of different cultures and different peoples, and what they can bring to what I do and what I can bring to what they do. I was very, very oriented around the classical European, North America, view of creativity and of the history of design and all that kind of stuff. And it's not irrelevant, but it's not everything by a long way. And I wish I'd been exposed much earlier. Now, of course, everybody does get exposed much earlier, so it's a much more kind of a melting pot idea. But yeah, I regret that.
Let's go ahead and go to Linda. Can you ask your question, Linda?
Thank you, Professor Johnson. Thank you, Tim. I'm Linda from Brazil. So my question is, in the philosophy of building in order to think, failure is also a part of the path to success. So considering the losses and waste expected in this process, how can underprivileged groups with limited resources practice design thinking in their context? Would that limit innovation to the upper classes and condition social impact to a top to bottom change?
Yeah, I think that's a really relevant question. I'm not even sure I've got the best of answers for it, to be honest with you, because it's clear that the fewer resources you have, the less you can afford to fail if it means losing those resources, right? So, I mean, this has been true. I mean, I've worked with on agriculture projects with farmers of different income levels, to be honest with you, in different parts of the world. And it's true of all farmers everywhere have this, they're ultra conscious of the fact that they can't afford to lose, particularly, 1 year's crops can mean the end of their livelihood, whether they're, a relatively wealthy farmer in the West or somebody that's living on $1 or $2 a day in, sub-Saharan Africa or wherever it might be. And I think that is a very real problem. And the more of the challenges we face, which are about basic resources, the more we are challenged to figure out how can we fail without failing, or how can we learn, how can we create the learning we need without that lack of resources. As I say, I'm not sure I've got very many good answers other than I think we can. I think it is possible to find, well, one, I think we need to provide help. We need to help each other, right? We can't expect people with no resources to innovate themselves or out of that situation. That's totally unfair and totally unreasonable. We've all had help. If we're fortunate enough to live in countries where we've had help with education or help with healthcare, we've all had help. And so I think we need to help each other. And so we need to provide those resources that can allow the learning to happen such that when it becomes the resources that are owned by those people, they are not put at risk. And I think that's a lot of the role of, foundations and NGOs and other parts of civic society, is to provide the resources in order that we can help each other. So I think and that obviously does happen. It doesn't happen to the extent that it should do, but it does happen. And then the other thing is, I think we need to, we can identify, excuse me a second. We can identify ways of improving things that are not necessarily at the very core of what of somebody's livelihood, right? I mean, we can help around the edges in a way that may not be so risky. And then finally, I would say there are so many great solutions out there already. A lot of the innovation is not in solving the problem differently, is actually sharing the problem, sharing the solutions differently. And more I realize that there's a particular class of innovation that happens in the world that happens at the local level that is very hard to scale, right? We know how to scale technologies, we know how to scale products because they can be made at large scale and then sent out into the world. But very many of the kinds of problems we're talking about around things like agriculture or healthcare or education or climate resilience actually have to be solved by communities at the local level. And there are many, many great solutions out there already, but they're very hard to share. And that's a problem that we have to solve, is how do we scale local community-based solutions? What does scaling them even mean? Excuse me, is it replication? What is it? And I think that's an issue to be tackled. So no great answers, I'm afraid, but absolutely recognize the issue.
Yes, great question, Linda. Chun, you have a question on education. Can you go ahead, Chun?
Thank you so much, Professor Jones. Good to see you again. Thank you, Tim Brown. And I'm a Chinese living in New Zealand, and I have a question about education. So you mentioned about teach organization to be more creative. And also you mentioned about education when you answered Linda's question. And also in your TED talk, you talk about we need to know what questions to ask before we actually doing things. But my kids actually ask lots of questions at home, but they most of the time answer questions at schools. So my question is, what is missing in our education for our future learning designers? And if we actually redesign education for our kids, what's the question we need to ask? Thank you so much.
Well, I mean, this is not a new idea. I mean, I think educators have been talking this for a long time, but you know, amplifying each of our individual curiosity is an important role for education as it is giving us the knowledge and information, existing knowledge and information that we need to navigate the world. And you know, obviously, as more and more knowledge and information has a shorter and shorter shelf life because of the rapid changes we see going on around us, then learning how to learn becomes an even more, an ever more important role for education, and a big part of that is curiosity. And I think, if you talk to whether it's designers, artists, scientists, even great leaders in all kinds of situations, the trait that they share is curiosity. It's like asking questions, particularly questions that other people aren't asking, that cause them to follow paths that other people don't follow. As I say, that's as true in science and technology as it is in art and design. Indeed, my favorite definition of science came from E.O. Wilson, the great biologist, who said science is the combination of bookkeeping and poetry. In other words, it was the discipline to know what you're doing and what you've done, but the creative leaps that come from the creative mind. And he was talking about very serious science, and that could just as easily be a description of design, So I think teaching, you don't teach curiosity, you unlock curiosity in people by giving them educational experiences, perhaps putting them in an environment where it's rewarded, where it's expected, where it's enjoyable. I'm actually quite hopeful, because in some ways the educational load that existed in previous times, for us to have to acquire all this knowledge that we had to carry around with us in our heads in order that it be available to us, we no longer have to carry around in our heads. We have it available to us in these devices we carry around in our pockets or our bags, and a lot more of it. And so we can leave the room in our heads for other things. And that in theory should provide us more time to be creative. I don't think it always does, because it's very easy to think that now we just have more answers available instead of better questions. I think there will be shifts in the way we educate. There are examples of it already in the world, where we're seeing a different approaches to education be quite successful, and we need more.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to try to sneak in one more question, Tim. This comes from Irendra around AI. Could you go ahead, Irendra?
Hello, Professor Tim. So I'm a great fan of you, and I have read your book, Changed by Design. So in your book, you have emphasized the importance of a human-centered approach in design thinking. So how do you envision this approach being maintained as we increasingly integrate technologies like AI and automation? So this is
thank you. Great. And I would say in some ways it makes it even more obvious and even easier, right? Because the one thing humans can be that machines can't be is human. right? And so some of those most human qualities, while machines can fake it, they can't actually be it. And so I think that you know, at the sort of kind of highest level, then you know, as we think about what qualities like like empathy, even like creativity, certainly creativity that responds to people emotionally, or is a response to emotions. All these kinds of things are deeply human and hard for machines to replicate. And I think these might be the things that become most valued. So I think it's too early to tell. I also don't think that AI is quite as clever as we all worry that it is at the moment. And I'm, you know, yes, there are certainly some dark scenarios that one can imagine. But a lot of what the AI is going to be doing is doing mundane things that we possibly don't want to do for ourselves. One of the things I'm excited about in our world, in the world of design, about the most recent breakthroughs in AI around this generative AI, is it does provide us with some tools for expressing our ideas much more easily and much faster than we ever could before, because the tools for expression of ideas are often very clunky because they're very complex, right? So, you know, anybody that's tried to learn Photoshop or Figma or any of these tools and really use them well, right, that's a lot of work. And it actually gets in the way of expressing ideas. And in fact, my criticism of many designers today is that they're great with the tools, but not great with their minds. And it's because they've had to invest all their effort in using the tools. And so I'm excited about the idea that we will have tools. We already now do have tools that for which the connection between our minds and the tool is much easier, and therefore allows us to express ideas without having to have this huge investment in skills around the tools themselves. And I think we'll start to see some really interesting benefits from that in terms of being able to design faster, in terms of being able to go from those post-its to real expressions of ideas much more easily. You know, in that way, that, you know, it'll be another example of design sort of, if you like, democratizing creativity. And, you know, as whenever you have one of these moments of democratization, what happens is you get this big spread of everybody being able to do something, and then the people who are really good go up another level, right? You get even more interesting things happening. So you get this sort of bifurcation that happens every time you get a new technology. So we'll see. It's still early, right? We're months into this, not years into it. So we'll see where it goes. But I'm actually quite excited.
Wonderful. Tim, I wish we could have more time with you, but unfortunately our hour is drawing to a close. On behalf of One League and everyone here, thank you so much for spending this time with us. This has been insightful and delightful and provided us a lot to think about. And you will always be welcome and a friend here at One League. I just want to turn it to Amima if you have anything else you want to add.
Thank you so much, Tim and Scott, for this incredible, unforgettable session. We'll no doubt remember this for decades to come. Tim, thank you for inspiring us to think big, design and redesign our world together. Let's propel centers of creativity and innovation all over the world with a curious and doers mindset, as Tim said, and do the work that can't wait and build the world that we want to live in together. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Tim and Scott, for this incredible session.
Thank you, Mima. Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everybody. It's been really lovely to meet you. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.